This audio reminds me of a wetland ecosystem. I love to hike, and some of my favorite places to explore are the freshwater wetlands in Ontario. And to me, this song is very reminiscent of these environments. The symphony of birds and the reverberating calls of the marsh warbler in the song reminds me of walking along a boardwalk through a marsh or a bog, with birds flying overhead or perched in the marsh rushes or trees. I can picture the rest of this ecosystem that is teeming with life to the backdrop of a chorus of birds. I can picture the mammals, such as beavers or a moose, that it is so exciting to get a glimpse of. The small frogs that occasionally jump into the water when you startle them as you walk across the path, and the incredible diversity of plant life to either side of the boardwalk. As defined by the Canadian government, wetlands are areas that are submerged or permeated by water, either permanently or temporarily, and are characterized by plants adapted to saturated soil conditions. Wetlands are complex and unique environments that provide many ecosystem services. Wetlands are important in watershed health, and they are able to filter out pollutants and sediments. They also have an important role in preventing flooding and erosion. Wetlands are important habitats for many organisms, and they also provide a space for recreational activities like hiking. Wetlands have traditionally been very important ecosystems for Indigenous groups across Canada. Wetlands provided a source of food and medicine, a way to make a livelihood, and a place of deep cultural and traditional significance. Cattails are one important plant to different Indigenous groups in North America, and they are able to make use of the whole plant. Various parts of the plant were eaten, and the fibers from stems and leaves could be made into mats, bags, or clothes. Another important traditional Indigenous wetland use was the wild rice harvest in freshwater wetlands along the Wolastoq in New Brunswick. Cranberries were also harvested from wetlands, usually in peat bogs. The cranberries were often incorporated into pemmican, an important food source for many Indigenous groups. Despite the importance of these ecosystems, there has been significant destruction and degradation of wetlands in Canada and Ontario. In southern Ontario, where I'm from, the land coverage of wetlands decreased from 25% prior to colonization to 7% in 2002, representing a 72% decrease. Losing wetlands means losing incredibly important and productive environments. These areas have a very high biodiversity and species richness. There are many types of fish, plants, fungi, invertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, and more found in wetlands. The selective pressures wetland organisms face has led to a variety of interesting features and adaptations. Aquatic plants, such as rushes, cattails, and the water lily in the picture, have aerenchyma to help them survive in this ecosystem. These are gas spaces in the cell that store oxygen and allow gas transfer between the roots and the shoots of the plant. This adaptation allows the plants to survive in waterlogged conditions. The diagram gives some examples of aerenchyma. Plants also have adaptations to acquire the limiting nutrient in bogs, which are a nutrient-poor type of wetland. Plant growth is restricted by the law of the minimum, which describes how a plant will be unable to grow beyond what the most limiting nutrient can support, even if the other nutrients are in abundance. Nitrogen is very limited in bogs, and some plants have developed a different method of acquiring this resource, rather than obtaining this nutrient from their roots in the soil. Pitcher plants are a species of carnivorous plants found in bogs across Ontario, and they have a pitcher-shaped structure that fills up with rainwater. Insects land in this pool of water, and the plants digest them using enzymes to acquire the limiting resource of nitrogen. The plant has additional adaptations to help it successfully trap the insects. Pitcher plants have fragrant nectar to attract the insects, as well as downward pointing hairs that make it very hard for the insects to escape once they are in the pitcher. Wetland ecosystem interactions are also influenced by competition. Competition is when different organisms are using the same resources in the same habitat, and it is detrimental to both organisms. In wetlands, species may diversify into different niches to avoid using the same resources. The pitcher plants exemplify this. They likely evolved their alternative way of obtaining nitrogen in order to reduce competition with the other bog plants that obtain their nitrogen below ground. Another example of competition in wetlands is competitive exclusion by invasive species. Invasive species are organisms that colonize an area where they are not native and that cause harm to the ecosystem. Once an organism is able to disperse to a new region, it may survive there and become invasive if the habitat is suitable. The competitive exclusion principle describes how when two species are competing for the same resources, one species is usually competitively dominant and eliminates the other species from the habitat. The European common reed is an invasive wetland plant now found in Ontario. It is highly competitive. It's able to rapidly colonize and monopolize the landscape and crowd out other species. It is also able to kill the other plants in the area, using toxins that it secretes into the soil. This is detrimental to the plant diversity of wetlands, since many are being eliminated from the area, and it also reduces suitable habitat for other marsh species that are adapted to using the native plants as their habitat. It is likely that some native species are able to survive, either by growing in places that the invasive competitor cannot, by getting a head start on growth, or possibly using a different resource from the competitor. However, many native plants are forced into a highly constrained, realized niche when this invasive competitor is present, and they may go locally extinct in some areas. An important feature of wetlands is their role in carbon storage. Bogs are a type of wetland called a peatland. Peat is an accumulation of partially decomposed organic material, and it is formed in bogs due to the wet conditions that prevent full decomposition. Plants make organic carbon using carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and when peat is formed, all of this carbon is stored, forming a carbon reservoir. Peatlands are able to sequester the most carbon out of any ecosystem type, and they hold 44% of all soil carbon. However, human activities have been moving much of this stored carbon back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Human impacts from draining peatlands, changing the land to be used for agriculture, burning the areas, and removing peat to be used as fuel all contribute to the degradation and loss of peatlands. This image shows the removal of peat. Through this degradation, massive amounts of carbon dioxide are released, contributing 5% of global human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. This is a very large amount for the very small land coverage of peatlands. Preservation and conservation of peatlands is very important in mitigating both the progression and the effects of climate change. But in some regions around the world, over 80% of peatlands have been lost or degraded. Canada has one of the highest percent land coverages of peatlands, of over 8% compared to the global 3%. In peatlands in Ontario and Canada, much of the peat material is from sphagnum moss, a type of bryophyte. Normally sphagnum moss is green, but sometimes it has pigments that make it red, as seen in the picture. Overall, wetlands are incredibly important ecosystems that are being rapidly lost and degraded. One way we can think about these environments and how to preserve them is through the lens of two-eyed seeing. This guiding principle, taught by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall, describes how we can view the world from an Indigenous perspective with one eye, and from a Western perspective with the other. The Western perspective of science has a focus on objectivity and quantitative measurements. The Indigenous perspective has a wealth of qualitative traditional knowledge, as well as a deep understanding of the intrinsic value of every living and non-living aspect of nature. Incorporating both of these distinct views allows us to use the strengths of both ways of knowing. Using two-eyed seeing and weaving together aspects of Western science with traditional knowledge and an understanding of the value of nature from an Indigenous perspective could help guide us on the path to effectively preserving wetlands across Canada.